do things will change. Their way they treat others will change. Because then their morals will be affected by the relationship with God. So if you want to change slavery, get people's hearts right, and slavery will eventually go away. You can get rid of it. Same way with abortion. Same way with prostitution. How do we get rid of prostitution? Oh, prostitution's a terrible. How do you get rid of it? Get people saved. Otherwise, you're really just putting a Band-Aid on it if you just try and fix society without fixing the hearts of people. The only way people are fundamentally changed is if they're fundamentally changed. And so in the Roman Empire where you had slavery, well, how do you change slavery? Well, change the way that masters deal with slaves and slaves deal with masters. And eventually it'll all go away. If you get somebody's heart right. Sir, listen, I was telling Babs, because we've had a terrible time with slavery in the United States, and we're still reaping for what was done with slavery those many years ago. But if people look at it in the ancient times, they say, well, what they should have done is they should have told them, just everybody release your slaves, and slaves just leave and don't recognize anybody as your master any longer. In 1 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul told him, he says, if you're a slave and you become a Christian, if you can be free, great. But if you can't be free, then serve God as a slave, right? So just continue on living that way. If you can get free, get free. If you can't, then serve God in the calling wherein you are called. And God will take care of it. But if they would have told them to get rid of slavery, and then had gone into towns and says, okay, stop slavery, well, what would that have done? That would have hindered the whole work of Christianity. The Roman Empire would have seen Christianity as an enemy of the state. And it wouldn't have allowed them to be able to spread the gospel. So we'll change it, but we'll change it by getting people saved. Just like the idolatry in Ephesus, they put the idol makers out of business, not because they protested idolatry, but because people got saved. When people got saved, they stopped buying idols, right? And so it's the same way with Christianity. And I was telling Babs, when in America with the slavery, I was listening to, it's very interesting, I didn't know such a thing existed, but somebody back in the early 1900s was smart enough to take a recording device and record elderly black people who had been slaves. They were still alive, but they had been slaves. And they asked them, what was slavery like when you were a slave? And it was horrific, some of the things they said. I mean, some of them said they would throw their food in a trough like an animal, and you had to eat like an animal, go to the trough and get your food out like an animal. But one of the things that stuck out to me that I'd never thought about, they said when the Civil War came and slavery ended and they told us we were free, we looked at each other like, what do we do now? Where do we go? We've got no money, we've got no job, we've got no home, we've got no food. So you tell me I'm free, but where do I go? So what seemed to be and was meant to be a kind act ended up being something that fundamentally wasn't kind, because it basically put them out on the streets. So I've got my freedom, but I'm out on the streets. I've got no way to get a job, no way to do anything. So if you look at Christianity here, as he begins chapter 4, he starts talking about the masters. He says, give unto your servants that which is just and equal. I told Babs the brilliance of God's wisdom in that, in dealing with it. He says, I'll tell you what you do. He says, instead of letting them free, he says, free them, but he says, treat them like a servant instead of a slave, and start giving them something that they can live off of. So if a master back in the 1800s would have looked at his people and said, listen, you're free to go. You have your freedom. But I really need you here. I can't do this by myself. I'm willing to give you house and food, and I'm willing to pay you a small amount. I can't afford much, but I'll give you some. And if you save that, you can buy your own property at some point. You can buy your own farm. And if you'll make that agreement, wouldn't that have gone a whole lot smoother? It seemed like to me, and that's exactly what Paul was telling them. He says, now if the masters start treating their servants in a way to where they're giving them just and equal, what was fair and what was equal to the task, he says, can you imagine, now you're ending slavery in a manner that's that changes everything. So in this whole thing here, when he talks about servants, he's telling you, okay, here you're a slave. If you can't be free, he says, obey your masters in all things according to the flesh, not with eye service, not when they're just looking at you, not as men pleasers, just trying to please men, but with a grateful, single heart, fearing God. Serve them as though you're serving God. And so whether you're a servant or a slave, or whether you're a servant, because really everybody that works for somebody is a servant. You've agreed to work for them for a particular amount of pay. So what he says is, be sure to make sure that you keep people's ideas of Christians at a high level by the integrity by which you do your job. If you do your job in that way, then how's an employer going to look at it? They're going to look at Christians and say, man, I wish I had 1,000 people like them. And it's going to be hard for them to say all these evil things that they're trying to propaganda against Christians. It's going to be hard for them to get by with it when everybody says, the Christians I come in contact with are not that way. Everything they do in word or deed is right and just and good. I can leave that guy to do a task, and I can go to the next town doing something else. When I get back, he's done everything I told him to do. That's invaluable to a worker. But it's not just that it's invaluable to that person, but it represents Christ the right way. And that's what we're interested in, is making sure that Christ looks good as you're doing it unto the Lord. You know, you're the servant. I do what I do for them, not because of them, but because of Him. You know, I have a higher standard. I live my life in the sight of God. And so I do what I do not because of them. Then he talks, and we're going to have to cut this off. But he makes sure you understand, listen, if your master mistreats you, they have a master in heaven that's going to deal with that. Remember when we studied James, what he said? He condemns these rich people. He says, you've held back the pay or the hire of those that have reaped down your fields. And he says, and their cries, the ones you've cheated, are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Sabaoth means the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies. And he says, what he's telling them is, you've mistreated them, and God's coming, and He's going to judge you for that. And so he tells the servants, now you do what you're supposed to do. You do as service as you're doing it unto me. If they're mistreating you, don't worry about it, because your Father which is in heaven knows what they've done to you. And feel sorry for them, because as much as they've done it unto the least of you, they've done it unto Him. And the Lord of Sabaoth hears these things. So your responsibility is, okay, they may treat me wrong, but I'm going to do what's right because I serve the Lord. And I'll leave God to take care of judging those that mistreat me or do me wrong. And the same way, I'll end with this, same way with husbands and wives. And if you fulfill your role and they don't treat you right, God's going to judge them for not doing what was right. You just do what you know is right. I can't let what others do affect me to do evil also. You may not recognize your vow. I'm going to recognize mine because I made it unto the Lord. So that doesn't affect what I do. You may not treat me right. I'm going to treat you right because I serve the Lord. Any questions or comments before we close out?